I should say that although this is a welcome relief from Brexit out of my comfort zone, in the sense that I'm a labour lawyer and I don't know much about trade laws, so whatever I say will have to be taken with a pinch of salt. But anyway, I just wanted to say that TTIP is only one of a number of trade agreements which have labour clauses. And the other one which is important is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which deals with the other parts of the world, again I think in which the United States is a key player, and according to the authors of the TPP, it covers about 40% of the global GDP, so that's important as well. And we've got a number of other agreements which have been negotiated by the EU, and we have got Korea, we've got Canada on stream, we've got negotiations with Japan, I gather. And so this is part of a big movement, so TTIP is not something we should be looking at in isolation. So the question really for labour lawyers, I guess, is what is the impact of these agreements on labour standards? And in a sense, I mean, it's quite a disarming question. And if you were gullible, you would think, well, what's all the fuss about? Because if you look at the agreements, they say quite clearly, for example, TPP, the parties to this agreement, including the United States and various other, I think 11 other countries, they reaffirm their commitment to international labour standards and a few other obligations as well. And if we look at certainly what the EU is demanding in terms of TTIP from the US, it goes stronger still, in the sense there's an expectation that there will be compliance, not just a reaffirmation, but a compliance with these international labour standards. And beyond that, an expectation that the US will use its best efforts to ratify those ILO conventions it has not yet ratified, and ensure that its domestic law fully complies with these international obligations. So in a sense, there is something there that labour lawyers can get quite excited about. But in a sense, we've got to ask ourselves the question, well, what is the effect in practice, not just of these recent multilateral agreements, but of the bilateral trade agreements that go way back to the 1990s and beyond. And so far as I can tell, there are three possible outcomes. And one is that, I mean, we take a benign view of this, that one possibility is that, yes, it will help. It will help to raise standards. And if you can look at the TPP, it's not just the substance of the agreement, but you see American power being deployed in what are effectively bilateral arrangements within TPP between the United States and individual countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei, in which the United States is insisting that these countries actually raise their standards to an acceptable level. And in the case of Malaysia, actually addressing important questions about trade union rights, collective bargaining, and demanding that Malaysia complies with various ILO obligations. So, in a sense, I mean, just taking an objective view, there's a possibility here. Even though we may question the motives, we may question whether it's appropriate, and we may question whether in practice this can ever really be realised, without asking questions about the impact of this on labour standards back in the United States, and presumably jobs will be exported to these countries. That's one option. But I think that is quite exceptional. The usual option, I think, or the usual position with labour clauses in trade agreements is that they make no difference whatsoever. They don't lead to a raising of labour standards. And there are a number of reasons for this. And one is that when countries, European countries, enter into these agreements, they enter into these agreements to make commitments which they are already in breach of, and which they have no intention of ever complying with. So if we take the EU position on TTIP in terms of the labour chapter, there's a commitment there to ensure that, not that we reaffirm, but that we comply, that all the parties comply with ILO standards. And that there's full ratification of the core standards and there's full implementation in domestic law. Well, the position is at the present time, so work which I did with my colleague John Hendy, the work that we did there, in a sense, looking at the position at the moment, it is already the case that 17 out of the 28 member states of the EU are currently in breach of 2 ILO core conventions on freedom of association. And there's no question of any domestic changes being made in any of these 17 countries. 19 countries are in breach of the social obligations of the social charter, and between them we've got 22 countries out of 28 in breach of labour clauses of either ILO conventions or the European Social Charter. But it's not just Europe. We've reached an agreement with Korea. Korea is in breach of core ILO conventions, some of which it hasn't even ratified. Canada, which we've now reached an agreement with, it seems, Canada is the most serial violator of labour rights in the developed world, and more findings against Canada by the ILO supervisory bodies than against any other developed country in the world. The United States, in the 1980s, although the United States have ratified fewer ILO conventions than any other developed country, the United States has nevertheless been told in the 1980s that you are in breach, your labour law is in breach of these core conventions, which you're now imposing on countries throughout the rest of the world. So you've got to admire the hypocrisy of this, if nothing else. So in a sense, we make commitments we have no intention of complying with, and which we cannot comply with, because we've got decisions of the European Court of Justice, we've got decisions of the US Supreme Court way back in the 1930s, which make it clear that these are obligations which cannot fully be met by the parties to these agreements. That's one reason why they have no impact. And the other issue, which I think is important, is that these agreements do not prevent the countries which conclude them from further violating the obligations which they are intended to comply with. And I great two examples really just to illustrate this. One is that while the British government was party to the negotiation of the Korea Treaty, which, as we heard, is a multiple treaty in the sense the United Kingdom signed this, and Cameron signed off the Korea Treaty. Well, this is going on, of course. Since then, we've got the Trade Union Act. And this year in Geneva, in the ILO Committee of Experts, has told us that the Trade Union Act is a violation of ILO conventions, which sits at the heart of the labour chapter of the Korea Agreement and of CETA, and presumably whoever writes TTIP, it will sit at the heart of the TTIP labour chapter as well. And the other example, I think, which I like better, is the Australian example. Australia signed an agreement, a bilateral trade agreement, with the United States in the 2000s, so 2003, 2004. And again, there is a commitment to, we affirm our commitment to these labour standards. But of course, Australia at the time was probably in compliance. Australia then elects a very right-wing government under John Howard, and they go about dismantling the labour law system in what was called the Work Choices legislation of 2006, and that has been found, or was found subsequently by the ILO supervisory bodies to be in breach of the ILO treaties, which are supposed to form the heart of the labour chapter of the bilateral agreement between Australia and the United States. So my sense is, the pessimistic message I have, in the sense that we're looking at the labour chapter of these agreements, not just TTIP, but these agreements as a whole. They have no impact because A, there is no intention on either party that they should have an impact, and neither party has an interest in enforcing the agreement against the other. In some cases, they have no impact because they cannot have an impact because of domestic or regional laws which forbid them from having an impact in the country in question. Thirdly, they have no impact in the sense that they do not prevent or don't stop further deregulation away from the labour standards which sit at the heart of the agreements. So that is the second, that in a sense in the middle is the most likely position with trade agreements in terms of their impact on labour lawyers, or on labour law. That's why I'm suddenly feeling no longer as gullible as I did at the start. I'm certainly feeling a bit pessimistic about this process. But we get to a third position, and this is the TTIP position. And in a sense, we've got one possibility that these agreements raise standards. Another possibility is that they're just neutral. But the other possibility, the third possibility, is they actually reduce standards. And this is why I think the European trade unions are very, very anxious about, thanks, nearly finished, why the European trade unions are very, very anxious about TTIP. Because despite these warm words and strong commitments in the Labour chapter, the effect of TTIP will be to deconstruct and destroy the collective bargaining arrangements which currently operate within European Union member states, except for the United Kingdom, because we've already gone to where TTIP would like us to go. We went there under Thatcher from 1980 through to 1997. And the challenge for European unions, I think, comes down to the question of collective bargaining. Collective bargaining in Europe is different from collective bargaining in the United States. In European countries, they have a system of regulatory collective bargaining, which is multi-employer, sector-wide, and covers at the moment, on average, about 61% of the labour force. Much higher if you took the UK out. Some countries it's 90% or higher. In the United States, they have a system of representative collective bargaining, which is enterprise-based, and which, as a result, some people estimate that about 6% of the labour force, the private sector labour force, is now covered by a collective agreement. Now, the effect of TTIP, I think, is that you will get investor demands from the United States to Europe. They will be demanding the right to do in Tuscany what they can do in Texas, which is to say, to take control of their own bargaining arrangements. And you'll get pressure from the European Commission and from national governments to be productive and competitive. And that will lead, I think, to an acceleration of a process which is already going on, which we saw in Greece, which is the deconstruction, deregulation, and decentralization of collective bargaining arrangements. And that is why I think European Union labour unions should be very, very worried about this process, because it's the most full frontal attack on their collective bargaining rights which they will encounter, since these structures were built in the aftermath of the Second World War. So my sense is that, I'm going to be objective as an academic, not as an activist. Trade agreements can have one of three options. You choose. You can be gullible or realistic. Gullible, you will err towards the favourable, benign end of the spectrum. If you're more realistic, you will in a sense say, well, it will have no impact. But if you're more realistic still, you will see this as a real danger and a way of imposing on the world the American system of labour law. So the National Labour Relations Act of 1935 becomes, in effect, the Transnational Labour Relations Act through the medium of free trade agreements. Thank you very much.